Ahlan wa sahlan, everyone, and thank you for joining us on what I think is the last panel of the Med Conference, Rome 2020 today. We are all in this situation together, and each region has its own particular problems. The pandemic has caused so much damage to economies and to people's lives. And we're hoping perhaps in this panel we can look at a potential silver lining, some good things that could come out the other end of the crisis that we're all living through. The economies in the MENA region have been particularly challenged. The IMF is projecting a contraction of growth by about 4.7% in 2020. I read a UN report recently that said that between the pandemic and the fall in oil prices, there is the bleakest economic outlook for the region in 50 years. Obviously, measures have had to be taken to contain the crisis country by country, and they have caused people to lose jobs. We've had huge challenges everywhere, including the MENA region, to the health systems, healthcare systems, and social stability. So on the other end of all this, we are going to talk today about whether this could lead to a reset of economies, of society to some extent, and ultimately a work world and societies that are more sustainable, that are more resilient, that will have reforms that will last forever and make great changes. I think one issue that our panelists are interested in touching on is regional cooperation, perhaps new economic blocks that could be a result of coordinated efforts dealing with the pandemic. And that's something that I know has been spoken about for a long time in the region, and to a large extent has not come to fruition yet. And I'd also, in your remarks, this goes to all of you, like perhaps you two articulate a bit what sustainability and inclusivity means for you in each of your countries. So I'm going to introduce the panel. I'm going to be moderating this together with Karim Al-Anoui, the president of the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco. And then we have Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister for International Cooperation of Egypt, Hamad bin Suleiman Al-Bazai, the Deputy Minister of Finance of Saudi Arabia, Sultan bin Rashid Al-Hater, the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry of Qatar, and finally, Jeffrey Schlagenhauf, the Deputy Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. But first, I'd like to introduce Guy Ryder in a little more detail, because the world of work has been something that has been deeply affected, obviously, by the crisis. And the ILO has been, for a long time, struggling for better equality in the workplace. In 2019, on its 100th anniversary, it declared a declaration on the future of work. And that, of course, was a dedication, a promise to shape a more fair, inclusive, and secure future of work, a more human-centered approach. And certainly the pandemic is creating a new set of challenges and perhaps obstacles to make this all possible. So to tackle this issue, I'm going to leave the floor now to Guy Ryder. And again, Mr. Ryder, if you could touch on what inclusivity and sustainability means in terms of the International Labour Organization. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, and greetings to all my fellow panelists. Thank you for this opportunity. As you said, Amy, we spent last year at our organization in our centenary year trying to work out what we thought the future of work would look like, and what we wanted it to look like, and what we would like to do to make it meet with our objectives. And then all of a sudden, COVID-19 rather changed the landscape, and we had to ask ourselves, do we have to have that discussion all over again? Is that declaration that we adopted last year still viable? we think most of the things that we said last year are still very much appropriate to the challenges that we face today. Now, what have we learned from this pandemic so far from a world of work perspective? Well, I think in the first instance, we have to all accept, and I speak from a Labour world of work perspective, that there is no exit from the very deep, unprecedented crisis in which we are all immersed without a solution to the health crisis. This is primordial. Countries are struggling to balance, I think, their reactions in the economic and social space to this health crisis. A lot of missteps have been taken. And if there's one thing we should have learned by now, it is that a solution to the health crisis, with hopefully a vaccine in the offing, is a precondition for progressing in the economic and social space. I say that endorsing all those who say that we don't have to make a choice between health and work or health and livelihoods, but we have to be very, very smart in the way that we combine our policy responses in both areas. The next thing I think that we have learned is that this virus in every sense has attacked the most vulnerable and those in the most disadvantaged positions, both medically speaking and in terms of their situation in labour markets. It has exposed in the cruelest way the precarities of the world of work and our past failures to address them. And I think the last thing I want to say, and it relates perhaps more directly to the question, the issue of opportunities that may arise from the current crisis, is that I think that this pandemic is going to leave long-lasting effects on the world of work after the pandemic itself has receded. It remains to be seen, because this type of question is not answered in advance. It remains to be seen if these are positive long-term effects, or, as is perfectly possible, very negative ones. Very much depends on what we do, what policymakers do. Now, what are the dimensions of the crisis today? We've been trying to track the metrics systematically over the last 9 months. Mid-year, we had lost the equivalent of 495 million full-time jobs in terms of a reduction in working hours in the world. 495 million. That figure is somewhat better today, but of course, where we are at the end of the year and beyond that will of course depend very, very heavily on the future trajectory of the pandemic itself. And for those countries in the grips of a second wave, I think we are wise not to be too confident in our predictions in that regard. What are policymakers trying to do? We see them trying to do 3 or 4 things. Firstly, of course, they're trying to stimulate their economies and keep economic activity going. They're trying to protect enterprises, trying to protect jobs, trying to protect incomes. And we know, and others may be better placed than me, that something between 11 and 12 trillion US dollars have been spent in these areas up to date. All of this is important. One qualifier on that 11 to 12 trillion is, by and large, this has been done, these resources have been applied with a minimum of international cooperation and coordination, something which distinguishes the reaction to this crisis from the rather better response that we saw from 2008 onwards. Sitting in on the G20 Leaders Summit last weekend gives you some optimism that we might rediscover our international cooperation reflex, understand better and act upon the understanding that we need a truly global response, both health-wise and economic and social-wise, to this global crisis. And if we do that, then I think that we will be able to improve our response and exploit better the real spaces of opportunity that exist. In terms of the longer term consequences, what can we conclude provisionally at this stage? Firstly, that this pandemic will probably accelerate underlying trends in the world of work, greater digitalization, which we're all having resort to under the duress of the pandemic, That's probably here to stay, and there's many policy issues that emerge from that. This pandemic is also reversing a lot of trends in the world. We were on a very positive trend of poverty reduction, of elimination of child labor, of eliminating forced labor in the world. Those positive developments have been thrown alarmingly into reverse, and we shouldn't ignore that. And I think there's a warning from this pandemic. We were badly underprepared. The international community has been talking for a very long time about disaster, catastrophe preparedness in all of its dimensions, be it health, be it natural disasters, be it conflict, but we have not put into place the infrastructure and the precautionary measures to deal with it. So I think the warning from this pandemic is not to believe that this is a once in a lifetime event. Things like this will happen, they will recur, and we need to be much better placed, both in the world of work and beyond, to do better in the future. I think I've taken my time and more than that, so I'll stop at that point. Thank you for listening.
I think Kareem was going to jump in with a question, but I'm going to fire one right at you, Guy, first. I'm wondering if there are any particular job areas, careers that have come to light as being underserviced with the pandemic in mind. Have we come out of this thinking we need more phlebotomists, we need more, I don't know, I'm asking what sort of areas of expansion you see as a result of this?
Well, I think there are two answers to that question. One thing the pandemic has revealed is just how badly we undervalue the jobs that certain sections of the workforce do. Undervalue and underpay and treat in an unfair and unacceptable way. And I think of frontline care workers in particular. The care economy is perhaps where the heart of my response to your question lies, Amy. We simply have to invest more in care and in health services. But think of the bus drivers, think of the supermarket cashiers, think of the cleaners. These are people who are at the bottom of the pile in most labor markets. And I hope that it will lead us to reconsider their situation in labor markets. Looking forward, well, I guess a lot has to do with what I mentioned earlier on, which is a likely acceleration and move towards digitalized organization of work. Are we going to be sitting at home in our living rooms around our kitchen tables, working from home? Allow me to say that I hope not, because I think that's not the right solution. I think we can learn a lot and take benefits from the, it's not all Zoom and gloom, as I say, there are some positives here. But I think obviously we're going to have to look at these things going forward. But if there's one thing I think that is really missing, and which has been so cruelly exposed by this pandemic, it is the gaps, the holes in our systems of social protection. We just simply have left too many people at work without even the rudiments of social protection. Let's not forget that in the world today, 6 out of every 10 workers, 6 out of 10, work in informal conditions. They don't have an employment contract. They're generally outside the coverage of labor and social legislation, pretty much left to their own devices. And for those 2 billion people in the world of work, I also think the pandemic has come to us as a wake-up call to be more attentive, more active.
Thank you.
I haven't been able to hear, unfortunately.
Is it better? Can you hear now? Okay. So, Mr. Wright, I have a question for you. What would be, you mentioned the informal sector and the social safety net and the huge number of people working, and particularly on the African continent where I'm sitting now here. What would be your single recommendation to government, practical recommendation to policymakers to improve the situation and sort of the workings of the labor market post-COVID to make sure we address some of the fragilities and the limitations you've mentioned?
Thank you. It's really the big question, isn't it? And it's not a question which comes with an easy answer. But we simply have to invest more political will and more resources in the people who lie in these most precarious sectors of the labour market. We've been working at the ILO on formalisation of informal work for a decade with our member states, and important progress has been made. In Latin America, there was, until the current crisis took hold, significant decreases in informality, but it needs a focused and deliberate approach to issues of informality. And the second point I would add to this is, there is a resource question underlying that policy challenge and many others as well. I mentioned earlier on that I think it is unfortunate that the international sort of reflex in response to this crisis has been rather missing. The G20 discussed at the weekend issues of debt suspension, of international resource support. I think this is a conversation which is moving in the right direction, and we thank our Saudi presidency of the G20 for the efforts they made in this regard. But, we have to do an awful lot more than this in terms of tackling debt sustainability and financial flows for development. And this is a big story. This is really a macro story. It underlies the whole of the international community's ambitions with respect to delivering the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And again, if the pandemic leads to a refocusing and a redoubling of commitments in this area, well, something good will have come of it.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Minister Rania Al-Mashat. First question is how Egypt has been doing, facing the crisis, but also what are the lessons you're drawing from managing and being part of the government managing the crisis?
Thank you very much, Karim, and my greetings to all the distinguished panelists. I enjoyed very much what Mr. Ryder was outlining as some of the downside risks going forward. Amy started her words by the IMF's regional economic outlook, which provided the size of contraction in the Middle East and North Africa, the MCD region. Egypt maybe is the only country that has been singled out in that report, with a positive growth rate in 2020 of 3.5% and expectations for higher growth rates in 2021. And this comes on the back of the key lesson that we learned, and that is reform is an ongoing process. You reform in good times to be able to weather whatever shock you face in bad times. Egypt started very heavily in a reform program, which was homegrown, supported by the IMF in 2016. It was concluded in 2019. It had addressing macro imbalances on both the fiscal side and the monetary side, in addition to sectoral changes and transformations, particularly in energy. And I know we'll be discussing that. So basically, we entered 2020 with comfortable buffers on both the foreign exchange side, as well as a primary surplus on the fiscal side. So that was fundamental, that you enter a crisis with a relatively comfortable position. And of course, this is a crisis that affects all countries, and therefore relativity makes a difference. Something else which was extremely fundamental in our situation is that there were very well-targeted programs designed before 2020 on the social solidarity front, on the education front, even on the health side. So for instance, we have with the World Bank a very ambitious program that happened on education for digitalizing education. So when COVID happened, and Egypt, with its students of around 13 million, everybody had to study from home and do homeschooling. You were able to roll out the reforms that you started, and basically we were able to move online from being physically at school. Similarly, on social solidarity, there was another very important program that reaches 2 million families. It's called Takaful and Karama. And also that was, we were in a position to be able to scale that up. Guy talked about the informal sector. Egypt has a sizable informal sector. And when COVID happened, we also wanted to be able to provide cash transfers to many of them. And it was made possible because there was a digital platform that the government started on before 2020. So the key lesson is try and be prepared. And the only way to be prepared is to continuously reform. And of course, part of the positive growth rate that we are enjoying now and the expectations going forward is because the government was very clear on many of the infrastructure projects it wants to do to be able to push the potential of the economy for additional investments and for additional jobs. So when the crisis took place, there was momentum that pushed growth. So this is how we were able to be prepared, if you will, and how during the crisis the economy continued going. We did not have a full lockdown. There was a partial lockdown. And when it comes to the health system, some of the very important also policy reforms that were taken ahead of time on health, for instance, the hepatitis C campaign that took place a few years ago to make sure that Egypt is free of hepatitis C. Also universal health insurance. There was a trial in Port Said governorate, and now it's being scaled up in other governorates, also through programs with the World Bank. So there is this focus and vision on how to move forward, and therefore we were more or less prepared. You asked me about my role as international cooperation within the government, and my role was to basically ensure that international cooperation on multilateralism continues. And I put it under one word. My ministry is responsible for economic diplomacy, and economic diplomacy in our view has three principles. One of them is multi-stakeholder platform. So we were able to bring the international community together to mobilize resources for priority projects during 2020 and onwards, and ODA SDG mapping. And I'm very happy that Guy mentioned this. We should not be derailed from the 2030 agenda. And it's very important that every country shows how its official development finance, if you will, is tailored towards the different SDGs. And this is an exercise that Egypt is doing, and we will come out with it very soon. And it's a very important exercise so that each and every development partner knows, and the citizens know, how the different financing is tailored to SDGs. And finally, to have a global partnerships narrative that unifies the efforts that are being done. And our narrative is people at the core, projects in action, and purpose as the driver. It's P and P and P. And this is something that we're doing with all our development partners.
Let me save in good times and spend in bad times. As a former central banker, it tells you a lot. Or be prepared, initial condition matters, keep on reforming, and always stay sort of aware of the environment to be able to react. So that's, I think, a very important lesson you are, explaining us. My second question is linked a little bit more to sustainability and long-term development, and it's about the energy transition and and particularly Egypt consumes lots of fossil fuels. What is the plan for greening the economy and preparing the energy transition in Egypt currently?
So, Karim, our energy transformation happened starting really 2014. So for those who were watching Egypt 2011, 2013, there were a lot of electricity cuts and really very fundamental issues. And then there was a plan that was devised that by 2030, by 2020, we will have 20% of our energy as green. What is happening now is that we are exporting electricity rather than having the shortages. And this was done through a very meticulous and important reforms in terms of subsidies to electricity, both for households and businesses. So this was one of the key issues that was holding Egypt back. Something else that there was encouragement of the private sector through feed-in tariffs that were allowed. And that's where we were able to mobilize very important both development finance as well as international finance for a Bin-Ban project. It's one of the biggest solar plants in the world. And this was based on also structural reform that the government did, believing in the importance of moving towards more renewable energy. Today, we have transmission grids that we are able to share with Africa and also other countries in the Middle East. And in the spirit of regional integration, there's also on electricity a lot that is happening with Jordan and Iraq. When it comes to petroleum, we were again in a position where there was a lot of shortage and we were importers. Now we're exporting that. Lately, the Ministry of Petroleum has also launched with other regional players the Euromed Gas Forum. So we do now export liquefied gas. So there's plenty happening on that. And one last point, and this is very important, this crisis has shown us that green matters. Everyone is talking about green recovery. Everybody's talking about, the private sector is talking about ESG all the time. So for any country to be able to mobilize resources and create an attraction for investments to create those jobs that you need, you will have to be part of the global green recovery. So this is something that you cannot shy away from. On the contrary, it has to be part of your policy mix and part of the narrative that you tell the world. So we're very mindful of that. And we are continuing with different plans. We are now zero coal in terms of our energy mix. And now there's a very important also hydro basically plans with Germany that are taking place. So we're very, steadfast in moving in that direction.
Thank you, Minister Al-Mashat. Amy, let me turn back to you and then we'll come back to you for other questions later on.
Sure, we'll just keep going as long as time permits. I'd like to turn now to the Deputy Finance Minister of Saudi Arabia, Hamad bin Suleiman Al-Bazai. A question to you, and this is not particular to Saudi Arabia only, but the double whammy, if you will, of the drop in oil prices plus the pandemic has no doubt set you back in terms of your plans to diversify the economy. I'm wondering how you've dealt with that and if there are any lessons that can be drawn for other countries in the region dealing with the same challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank you for the invitation. And also I'm pleased to join this distinguished panel. I'm really, I was there in Rome last year. It was quite 1 year, but a lot of things happened. And for sure, the world economy has been through a dramatic change in the wake of this pandemic. Needless to say, the pandemic is unprecedented, actually. It's not only just a crisis for economies or governments, it is individual level, families, households, countries, communities, international. It's really something that was, it's really a challenge to all of us. For us, as you mentioned, we, as the economy dependent on oil, for sure, it's something that with the drop in the very sharp drop in oil prices, as well as we have that much of non-oil revenues in the past. But actually, we are fortunate to deal with this crisis by the actual. There have been underway since 2016 and even before in our Vision 2030. It has been very helpful. At least some of the fruits we are having some some results, positive results in terms of non-oil revenues. Now it's almost 50% or so with the decline in oil revenues. We took very bold measures. One of them is which is unprecedented in many countries, is to raise the VAT from 5 to 15% this year, starting 1st of July. And also there are a lot of measures. As it is the case with many countries, it is the health. The priority is to protect the health of citizens and residents. It was really something that we had to prioritize the spending in our budget, and we created a special location or a special program within the budget is to really reallocate part of the budget, some of the money to the top priority, which is the health sector, to enhance the capacity, to increase the capacity, intensive care hospitals, to make sure that we are ready for the pandemic and for the health issues. The second is that to support the most vulnerable. First of all, to protect employment and for Saudis, and the same time is really to help private sector and really vulnerable sectors with the lockdown and the closures to make sure that they are at least sustain or at least to at least to pass this very difficult time. Now with these measures, hopefully now things are going not to normal, but at least close to normal. Now with the revision of maybe some of you may be having read the revision, the IMF revision. One of the few countries that we are revised upward the second half of this year. And we are looking forward very positively next year and for the growth, but very positive growth next year. For sure, we were helped by, as I said, the diversification efforts that the government undertook in the past and undertaking now. At the same time, the measures that were undertaken to help the sectors, to help the households, to help people, the workers, just to make sure that they don't lose their jobs. And this will, as I said, help the economy. Till now, we are experiencing quite positive. Now, we are in an economy that is now the positive, not positive growth right now, but at least it's the negative growth is being reduced, or at least or close to the zero growth. And then, as I said, in the next year we will be we're expecting a very positive, around 3%.
What would you say are some of the biggest growth areas that you envision outside of fossil fuels?
Actually, we are now developing the tourist sector, tourism. It's really something that it's some people that think Saudi Arabia is not. Now it's internally. Now people discovering Saudi Arabia, and because there were with this kind of closures and ban on travel in many countries, that and actually we many people discovered that the travel within the country is becoming it's a choice. It's really. And also the other sectors, that is in the case with other countries, it's the IT sector becoming quite, yes, we are most of the time in the past working from home, not only just government, but also private sector. It's really, there are new opportunities. Yes, we are losing many countries, they are losing some opportunities in some sectors, but growing viable and very good opportunities in other sectors. And actually this crisis has been helped in advancing the developments in other sectors like in Saudi Arabia, like the IT sector, the tourism and others, which is really something that we envisage that this will continue in the future.
Thank you. I want to go now to Qatar and to the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Sultan bin Rashid Al Khater. How do you see a post-pandemic recovery in terms of an inclusive and sustaining recovery for your country?
Hi, Amy. Hi, everyone. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be with you at this prestigious gathering to exchange views and discuss the restructuring of the MENA economies after COVID-19. Let me maybe take you through some key highlights of Qatar interventions with respect to this really the challenge of the pandemic. Qatar has stressed the importance of cooperation and partnership to mitigate the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted various industries and businesses around the world. Qatar continues to make unremitting efforts and has taken proactive steps to deal with the repercussions of the pandemic by investing in innovation, technology, and science to enable urgent and effective measures to contain the virus and mitigate its impact. To prevent excessive economic disruption, Qatar is providing support to the private sector through an economic stimulus package of 75 billion Qatari riyals, like other countries have done. Large programs of loans and guarantees have already been put in place to support the private sector. Qatar's stimulus efforts have not only been restricted to quantitative easing, but have been extended to fiscal policies to support private companies affected by the crisis. The measures taken by Qatar proved successful according to several indicators such as the domestic or foreign liquidity of the banking sector, which was not affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Available data reveals that liquidity rates continued to rise at the beginning of 2020 by a higher percentage compared to the end of 2019. Despite the repercussions of the pandemic, banks operating in Qatar continued to provide credit facilities and financing to various sectors, reflecting the strength of the banking sector and its resilience, where the volume of funding jumped due to stimuli. The trade balance continued to achieve positive surpluses, and Qatar's exports began to rise as of May 2020 due to the gradual lifting of restrictions and the resumption of economic activity, reflecting the effectiveness of the measures and economic stimulus taken by the state. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry in Qatar effectively contributed to the state's efforts to respond to the coronavirus pandemic through a flexible and integrated strategy that protected the private sector from the first wave of the crisis and helped businesses adapt to the new reality after the partial lifting of restrictions. The local private sector has played a key role, and this is where inclusiveness is really raised in this panel, in helping really, especially Qatar, overcome the COVID-19 crisis during the pandemic into economic opportunities that can be built on, especially in the trade and industry sectors. The methods of producing, importing, and storing goods within the country have undergone changes in order to overcome the pandemic. A good example, Qatar Development Bank has launched a business promotion program to help companies adapt to the new reality after partially resuming business. QDB, the Qatar Development Bank, also launched the Turning Challenges into Opportunities Award for the best performing companies during the pandemic, with the launch of an online assessment and monitoring program in July, which aims to identify and fill skills gaps for startup entrepreneurs. The strategic policy really for post-COVID-19 recovery is not an easy one. However, it is really a mandatory objective for all nations. The uncertainty remains in terms of investment recovery, but the post-crisis environment will influence investment policies and investors' behaviors. The governments are considering, at least in some industries, more protectionist policies and import substitution strategies to rely less on global value chains. Here in Qatar, keeping up investment climate reforms, Qatar aims to become a leading country in terms of its business and foreign investment environment. The government issued a law that allows non-Qatari investors to own 100% capital in various sectors, while many Qatar Stock Exchange listed companies have increased their foreign ownership limit to 49%. The organization of the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar is expected to attract large amounts of foreign investors in the coming years. Going into really more on an external, really helicopter view of the pandemic issues. Since the pandemic outbreak, Qatar really has maintained its commitment to a multilateral trading system and strengthened international cooperation frameworks to ensure trade safety and continuity as the engine for economic recovery. In this context, Qatar has stepped up efforts to enhance its advanced logistical networks and to capitalize on its high-quality infrastructure to consolidate its position as a regional and global trade and investment hub. Today, Qatar offers investors access to logistics areas and free zones in strategic locations in close proximity to Hamad International Airport and Hamad Port, as well as a high-speed road network designed in line with the highest international standards. Qatar free zones provide investors with access to a skilled workforce, investment funds, and quality infrastructure, while allowing 100% foreign ownership and offering tax exemptions and partnership opportunities with Qatari entities. Qatar's highly developed infrastructure also acts as an important catalyst for companies to invest in value-added sectors, particularly the industrial, technological, and logistics sectors. Earlier this year, Qatar took an important step forward in this direction with the issuance of a private-public partnership law that expands the country's investment horizons. The law provides a legislative framework that contributes to improving governance, risk management, and promoting competition and innovation to bolster Qatar's dynamic business environment. Investors will have the opportunity to finance, develop, and operate projects in a variety of priority sectors, including food security, sports, tourism, health, education, and logistics. The law will deliver a major boost to Qatar's business environment as preparations continue to host the World Cup with the development of new projects. These key reforms has bolstered the inflow of foreign direct investments and created a dynamic business environment that appeals to foreign investors. With a closing analogy, I'd like to really, with my background in industry, I'd like to give the example that, the pandemic is not really going to shut down a factory. In operations of factories and plants, we do really respond to such really emergency problems and shutdowns, and we restart and recommission facilities. Likewise, countries really need to intervene in order to put stimulate packages to recover really the health of society and to recover economy, as well as really to boost really the health of our ecosystem back and put it online again. So I'd like to close with this, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Mr. Schlagenhoff, let me ask you a question from your view of the world sitting at the OECD, an advanced economy institution, looking, of course, working on disseminating good practices and from a policy perspective in advanced economies. First question would be, how do you assess the response of the region, of the MENA region, the crisis, as compared to what you've seen in advanced economies? We've been sort of very amazed by some, the incapacity of some very advanced economies to provide very basic goods to their populations, masks and things like that in the initial stages of the crisis. But there is much more, of course, in terms of providing health services for population and responding in terms of macroeconomic terms, etc. So, what's your assessment, basically, of the region's sort of performance response as compared to what you usually see in advanced economies and members of the OECD?
Okay, that's a big question. So first of all, let me start by thanking the Med Secretariat for this opportunity and invitation. and for the excellent cooperation we've had over time, and also to be included on such an outstanding panelist list and giving me an opportunity to hopefully contribute to the discussion. The OECD has been at the forefront of rethinking prosperity, going beyond growth, and putting citizens' well-being at the top of the agenda. As part of the MENA OECD initiative on governance and competitiveness for development, which is currently chaired by Tunisia and Italy, MENA partners are actively engaging with OECD countries in what is truly a cutting-edge policy dialogue on what measures need to be put in place to foster citizens' well-being. The pandemic has shown us that while shocks might seem systemic across countries, they have very different impacts on groups within our societies. OECD evidence suggests that the COVID-19 crisis has actually accelerated existing inequalities. For instance, among people from disadvantaged backgrounds, our estimates show that this crisis will cause an additional 8.3 million people to fall into poverty in the Arab region alone. Among young people who have been affected by the closure of schools and universities, as well as by disruptions to their employment, recent estimates suggest that on average, students have already lost the equivalent of 1/3 of a school year of learning during the crisis. And sort of to extrapolate that, that amounts to about a 3% loss in lifetime income. Women, in particular, have faced an increased risk of domestic violence and an increase in the unpaid care work they undertake, as well as a higher risk of losing their job due to their overrepresentation in informal and part-time employment. Estimates suggest that approximately 700,000 women will lose their job in the Arab world alone as a result of the outbreak. We know that there are about 14 million displaced people hosted in Jordan, Lebanon, and other MENA countries who have limited access to sanitation facilities and overly rely on jobs in the informal sector. It's crucial that recovery measures take into account and address these inequalities if we are to build back better, resilient, and inclusive institutions and societies. But the big question is, how do we do this? By engaging citizens, especially those who are marginalized, in finding solutions to the crisis and promoting gender and age diversity in state institutions. I think it's to be noted that countries like Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt have established youth quotas to promote youth representation in parliament. Strengthening systems to collect systematic, reliable, and gender disaggregated evidence, and encouraging coordination across government so that recovery measures can leverage this evidence to address inequalities. For instance, in Tunisia, the Ministry of Women's Affairs is actively involved alongside other ministries in the committees in charge of elaborating the crisis response. In Egypt, the National Council for Women monitors government's recovery measures from a gender perspective. By adopting governance solutions to manage critical risk and ensure the resilience of critical infrastructures and public services to current and future shocks. For instance, governments in the MENA region have promoted the adoption of teleworking arrangements, digital services, and innovative hygiene protocols to facilitate the delivery of public services and business continuity. In this context, multilateral and regional cooperation is of the utmost importance. This year, Saudi Arabia successfully steered the G20 response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the corollary economic crisis. The G20 action plan, developed with the support of the OECD, provides clear avenues to make our economies more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. We certainly look forward to continue working with Italy in that direction as part of its upcoming chairing of the G20 next year, in order to lead and promote multilateral and regional dialogue in these unprecedented times. Less than a month ago, OECD ministers convened for the 2020 meeting of the Council here at the OECD at the ministerial level to discuss the path forward towards a strong, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery from the pandemic. They rightly underlined how the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the need for strong international cooperation and effective and transparent multilateral institutions to tackle the cross-border dimensions of the crisis and ensure that we have a level playing field for the recovery through, among others, advancements on digital taxation and anti-corruption, which is really key in this environment. There's a lot of money out there and corruption chases the money. So we need to be conscious of that. The OECD, notably through the MENA OECD initiative and its dedicated training center in the city of Caserta, hosted by the Italian National School of Administration, has been supporting multilateral and regional dialogue across the MENA and OECD countries for more than 15 years. You can count on the OECD to continue acting as the house of good practices, to assist governments and public officials in designing and delivering recovery plans in line with the objectives set by OECD ministers, and to provide a forum for multilateral and regional dialogue for a strong and inclusive recovery in the MENA region and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fagenhaf. Can you, you've insisted a little bit on youth and their contribution to the response and sort of involving them in policy design in the response to the COVID. As you're well aware, youth unemployment is a big challenge for many countries in this region. It's of course an opportunity, no doubt. So what would be, what are the lessons you draw from the crisis? What are the recommendations that are emerging from your research? Would you like to share with us here in the audience? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's very clear is that the COVID-19 crisis has really put a spotlight on young people and the challenges they face in these circumstances in terms of education, employment, their income. And I think something we don't think often enough about is also their mental well-being. But most importantly, in my view, the crisis has also shown that the youth, and especially young volunteers, play a crucial role in ensuring the resilience of our societies. In the MENA region and beyond, they have helped mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. For instance, by running awareness-raising campaigns and providing support to the elderly. In Tunisia, youth organizations have been offering online courses for kids to learn entrepreneurial skills while they're at home. In Lebanon, youth organizations have supported crisis responses efforts following the disastrous explosion at the port of Beirut. Yet, young people continue to be a largely untapped group of partners for governments and are significantly underrepresented in public institutions. For instance, on average across the 10 MENA countries, only 16% of members of parliaments are below the age of 40. Hosting one of the world's youngest population, the time is right for governments in the MENA region to create conditions in which young people can thrive, flourish, and to invest in the relationship between youth and public institutions. This is absolutely vital for governments to mobilize support for structural reforms. Indeed, the OECD trust framework highlights how trust between citizens and government is critical for policymaking and the functioning of societies. Trust provides legitimacy to institutions, strengthens social cohesion, and facilitates the implementation of public policy. For instance, in 2018, just 32% of young people expressed trust in their government across the 12 MENA countries, compared to 46% across OECD countries. Both are very disappointing statistics that need to be improved. Young people need to trust institutions and institutions need to trust young people. Without that, recovery measures will not be effective, nor will they be sustainable over the long term. Rebuilding a trusting relationship between governments and youth will take time and effort. It will need effective and modern public administrations that deliver on the concerns of young people. It will require investments in youth policy and services across the MENA region, as well as efforts to strengthen coordination across government and with civil society. It will require the governments to engage youth on an equal footing in the decision-making process. International cooperation can promote the involvement of young people in the recovery phase by ensuring their direct engagement and by supporting governments towards the adoption of tools and frameworks to integrate a youth lens in their policy. For instance, OECD established a strong network of youth organizations in MENA and OECD countries, which have contributed, among others, to the recent OECD Youth and COVID-19 policy paper. Furthermore, the OECD, through its MENA OECD governance program, has supported Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia in promoting youth participation in public life. Through its support in the formulation and implementation of national youth strategies, the establishment of adequate legal and institutional framework, and the creation of innovative engagement tools. International and regional cooperation are absolutely crucial to ensure youth's involvement in the recovery phase and in supporting governments as they work to formulate and deliver a youth-friendly recovery. And ultimately, this is really the key, this engagement to rebuilding trust between youth and public institutions. And we're talking about youth right now. This applies across the board. Reestablishing and building trust between citizens and public institutions is absolutely critical if we're going to emerge from this and build back a better, more sustainable and more diverse, friendly economies in society. Thank you.
Karim, shall I go back to Guy Ryder with a question now?
Please do so.
Okay. So, Guy Ryder, please, I'd love to know what you consider inclusivity and sustainability to mean in the MENA region when we're talking about reforms in the labor market as it moves forward post-pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and I think I can pick up on a lot of the things that have been said by my fellow panelists in trying to answer your question. I think wherever we talk about sustainability, I think we think there are three dimensions to address. One is, of course, environmental sustainability, much on our minds, and of course, some of my colleagues have talked already about the role of hydrocarbons and diversifying out of hydrocarbons. We clearly, and the MENA region is no exception to the rule. We all in the world of work have a challenge about making a transition to carbon neutrality, and I think it's fortunate that there is momentum in international processes. The Paris agreements give us a framework to work together around. But one thing is very clear: public support for action on ecological sustainability does depend on people being reassured that there's still going to be work, there's still going to be development prospects, there's still going to be pathways out of poverty from a better life. Nobody is renouncing those ambitions in life in order to achieve carbon sustainability. And I think the challenge needs to be looked at in those terms. Then if you look at the other two dimensions, I'm going to lump them together in the interests of time: economic sustainability and then social sustainability, these two other dimensions. Well, I think this pandemic has made us ask ourselves some fairly fundamental questions about the resilience and the sustainability of our economic arrangements and our social arrangements. I have to say, I think we all have to be worried about the fact that whatever happens in the longer term, in the foreseeable future, we're going to emerge from this pandemic in a world where there is higher unemployment, higher poverty, higher inequality, higher levels of public debt, which of course constrains our capacity to respond to these problems, and I think as a consequence, higher levels of social frustration. And I think inclusivity is really the way we need to address these challenges. I want to just echo everything my colleague has just said from the OECD about youth and young people. It is an unfortunate reality that for many, many decades now, unfortunately, the MENA region is the region which has recorded the highest levels of youth unemployment. It's just a fact. And that has to do, I think, with some of the structural challenges that exist in very different ways, because it's a very varied region in MENA economies. We've talked a little bit about informality. I won't revisit that. I think there's a challenge in many of the economies to cultivating a truly innovative and prosperous private sector, which is capable of generating employment opportunities, bringing in young people to decent work trajectories. It's sometimes surprising to me, and I'm sure there are people here who are more familiar with this phenomenon than I am, that in many countries, youth unemployment actually correlates directly with levels of skill. That is to say, the better educated and the more skilled some parts of the youth population are, the more likely they are to be unemployed. And that has, in a sense, something to do with young people's expectations of labour market. I think historically, there has been a high propensity of young people to look for inclusion in the public sector, that the state will provide the places that they seek in labour markets. And that's quite problematic, I think, as we move forward. And it argues, I think, for some very careful consideration about the role of private enterprises and the private economy. And linked to that is, of course, issues of education. One of the things we've seen in this pandemic, of course, is the interruption of educational activities, education and training, be it in the classroom or at workplaces. And that has, I think, brought to light two things. Firstly, the fact that in some countries and in some circumstances, it's been possible to migrate learning to digital platforms to do remote learning. But of course, that is predicated on digital connectivity, being able to connect up to distance learning processes. And that is a major manifestation of the digital divide which exists and to which some in the MENA region are disadvantaged by. So I think we have to look at digital connectivity in respect of learning opportunities. And finally, obviously, inclusion of young people, of course, inclusion of women in labour markets. And in the same vein, we do know that women's participation in labour markets in MENA regions, again, by international comparison, remain very, very low. I know that some major efforts are being made to increase such participation, and I think we're all aware of the different factors at play in such labour market participation. Generally, it's not about educational achievements, because I think women tend to record, in many cases, better educational performances than their male counterparts. So we've got to look to the other obstacles and facilitate access to labour markets for women as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Amy, if I may, I would like to turn to Minister Al-Mashat on this particular issue of the informal sector, which I guess has to do with the sustainability you were mentioning initially. What it really means deep down is maybe, participation to society and being, sort of protected, having access to various protections in terms of social safety net, etc. So, Minister Al-Mashat, can you share with us a little bit the experience of Egypt and what you've been doing and the achievements and difficulties and the lessons you draw again from policies in this area in your country?
Thank you very much, Karim. Can I just comment something on gender and women before I go to the informal sector? So Egypt was one of the very first countries to put a gender-sensitive policies around COVID, and there's a monthly policy tracker where it's highlighted which are the policies that the government took during these past few months that are tailored towards women. And the latest report by UNDP put Egypt in the first position in the Middle East and West Asia with 21 policies related to gender during COVID. So this means that we're very mindful of the implications on women as a vulnerable group. Something else that we're doing also, the National Council for Women, and Jeffrey had mentioned National Council for Women with the Ministry of International Cooperation and the World Economic Forum. We have launched the Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator. It's the first also in Africa and the Middle East and North Africa region. And it is to actually create more jobs. It's a public-private platform. So we have co-chairs from the private sector as well. And we put together an agenda over 3 years to be able to increase women's participation in the labor force, basically reskill because of COVID, and actually try and push for remuneration parity. So these are just some of the efforts related to women and the central bank. Also, in terms of financial inclusion, there are certain programs as well to push the gender agenda. And it's the conviction that if we use the borrowed words from the IMF, women participation is macro critical. So if you want to get out of this downturn and push growth even further, then we have to be mindful of how to integrate more into the labor force. So this is on the woman or the gender agenda. When it comes to informality, it is a challenge for the region. In our case, it is quite sizable. There are many discussions that the economy continued running during 2011 and some of the period after it because of the informal sector. But there is very concerted efforts to try and formalize them, if you will. And this has happened in more than one way. There has been a new SME law that was passed, and in it there are incentives for trying to attract some of the informal activities into the formal sector. As I mentioned during COVID, the digital or the database that the government started before 2020 putting together for the informal sector, that was expedited. And now you have many of the workers registering on the website of Cabinet so that they can receive some of the immediate assistance. But this is a very important step because later on it means that we have the database and we have 2 million already registered on that database, and the process continues. Also, when it comes to using digital tools to be able to include more of these segments, there have been, because of COVID, a lot of the structural reforms that the central bank wanted to do on financial inclusion were expedited as well, so that whether it's the pensions that could be basically paid rather than people going to banks and so forth. So the silver lining, if you will, has been a lot to do with greater, expediting some of the reforms on the financial inclusion agenda. When it comes to the informality, pushing further the social solidarity and the social safety net programs that we already had, but you could increase those. And then also on the informal sector. Let me just mention something that we are doing with the ILO, since we have Mr. Ryder with us. So making sure that different SMEs are able to tie in with the bigger businesses, particularly in the food processing and the agriculture sector. So with ILO, we have this program where technical assistance is provided to small and medium enterprises. And we have very successful examples where they have been actually tied to bigger international firms such as Danone, if you will, so that we are creating this, increased value added from the different firms. So there are plenty of programs that we are doing. And being the Minister of International Cooperation, I'm always trying to create that narrative that the country has the commitment and the vision, but it's with the international community that we are able to create programs which are recognized internationally, best practice, And in it, the inclusion of civil society is there because most of the work that is done with ODA is either sovereign projects or private sector that benefits, or it's a private-public partnership, but many of the UN agencies that are doing work through projects on the ground, they are through the civil society, which includes the youth, includes women, where we want to activate that even more. And just yesterday, we passed the legislative agenda for the law on civil society. So this is also something very important, and therefore 2021 will be hopefully the year of showing the actual work that is done by the grassroots in the country. NGOs played a huge role during COVID. If you take a look at, for example, El Hilal Al Ahmar, the Crescent, with USAID, with Uber, for instance, there were several programs to be able to provide help to the healthcare workers and also psychological help, if you will. There were many programs for SMEs through NGOs to help women manufacture the masks. And now, they are actually, they took the acceptance of the Ministry of Health, and they're actually selling these masks to firms and factories. So there are very important initiatives, and the idea is to show these initiatives and actually, scale up. So the word that we want to use is whatever was successful before 2020, during 2020, let's shed light on those and basically scale them up, because that's what's going to create the employment and create the inclusivity that I think many of the distinguished panelists also mentioned.
Maybe I could turn now to Minister Al-Bazai again. Talking about cohesion, here in Europe, there was a lot of squabbling at the beginning of the pandemic that the richer countries weren't helping some of the poorer countries out, and Russia and China were blazing in with lots of medical supplies. I think the Italians were asking where the Germans were and where the French were. And so there was a lot of soul searching within the European Union about whether or not there was enough cohesion and helpfulness between countries. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the Arab world. Granted, it's less of a cohesive unit than the European Union is, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how you did helping out one another and coordinating relief. And if you don't have any strong thoughts on that question, I would ask you how post-pandemic you would like to see perhaps the expansion of coordination, and particularly economic coordination.
Thank you very much. Regarding the first part, which is the helping out and coordinating, and I would like just to highlight what the Saudi government did in two fronts. And multilateral front, the government already, as you may have heard, the $500 million to the WHO to help the less developed countries and least fortunate countries in trying to cope with this crisis. And also on the bilateral front, we have the King Salman Center for Relief, which really had done a lot of work in helping in other countries, especially poor countries, in medical supplies and other humanitarian assistance. As it was mentioned by many, it's the cooperation, international cooperation is essential. Regional as well as international cooperation is very important. And post-COVID, I'm sure that it's stressing the fact that it is important. It is proven to be essential to continue cooperating with each other, not only just in financial front, but also in really spreading the experience and trying to benefit from each other's experience in dealing with this crisis, and which lessons that we can draw from that, and what lessons that we can share with each other.
on an economic front, it is really proven to be, as it is the case with many crises. Yes, this crisis is unprecedented, is different from, let's say, international financial crisis in 2008, but it's similar in its impact on economic and government finances. It shows how building cushions, strengthening the physical stance in a country, the flexibility in budget and easy prioritizing and moving funds from one use to another, and trying to have this kind of cushions, and having the strong social safety nets to help the most vulnerable, be it individuals or sectors, just to preserve, as it's the case with the International Labour Organization, to help and preserve employment and jobs, and especially the most vulnerable people, women and youth. All these lessons can be learned, and how to deal with the crisis. It's so international cooperation in trying not really to help each other in trying to find the best ways to deal with these pandemics. Unfortunately, many people talk this will be the isolated incident. Maybe in the future, we may face another crisis, maybe bigger than this, but hopefully that we can build some kind of experience and resilience again, economic as well as social. It's not just on economic front, and how to deal with this kind of a crisis that is not just economic crisis, but this one at least from top of my mind, just to it's helped from our experience. We have learned, as it's the case, being in the past dependent on one source of income, mainly 90% of our revenues coming from oil. And we know the revenues is so fluctuating. It's difficult even to plan, to plan our spending, to plan our budget. It's really difficult. But emphasizing the obvious fact, it is really to have a very diversified revenue base, very diversified economy, very diversified sectors, not only just the economy, even within sectors. In a way, it is easy to move from one employment to another. It's training people, investing in IT, and all these that can help really dealing within a crisis that may come in the future. But 2020 to 21, we are hoping that with the vaccines, hopefully, and with better understanding of this pandemic, hopefully that things will be better. And also, again, drawing lessons from what we went through together is very important.
Karim, I'm getting the message that we need to wrap this up. So my thought was to ask the representatives of different countries on our panel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, perhaps, what they think they did best during the pandemic. But if you have another question to sort of end on, I defer to you.
This is great. In 1 minute each.
Okay.
So we can start maybe
with Qatar, maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
تفضل يا أستاذ.
Oh, thank you. Well, I would really maybe put it in a short context that there are lots of lessons learned. The pandemic has really uncovered all our troubles or challenges, and we have learned a lot. How to develop new policies, new thinking, and also how to really extend to multilateral collaboration in a better way. So we are dealing together with this situation. The world has come together. So we'd like to really think also more in advance on how to deal with the vaccine with fairness and just in order to reach all those who needs it.
Thank you. Egypt in the house.
For us, I think the biggest lesson is you have to be agile. as policymakers and continue innovating. We saw the biggest fire drill in history. I mean, how could you ever imagine that the Egyptian bureaucracy would be working from home, for instance? It happened. So there's no catalog for this crisis, but I think the agility of policymakers, the agility of the private sector, the agility of citizens in raising up to the plate and internalizing all of this very fast and being able to raise to the challenge. I think agility is very important, reforming all the time so that you can create the resilience you need. As Mr. Ryder mentioned, this is not going to be the last crisis, but at least building the resilience within the system to be able to face what comes next.
Minister Al-Bazai.
Thank you. Just so I think one of the lessons, as I mentioned earlier, but I think one of the crises presents us with the opportunity to rethink really and how to prioritize our strategies. One of them is really to, as it is proven to be, to contain the health crisis and cushion income losses. And also it's very important for our countries, especially developing countries, and in particular least developed countries, is really how to build inclusive-based structural reform and how to be flexible, easy to move funds from one use to another in a way that can address the pressing needs or emergent requirements, and how to strike the right balance in addressing competing, again, priorities in a context of a declining physical space. Not every country has this physical space that they can draw from, that they have the resources to draw from. It's really difficult for every country, and really how to prioritize again is one of the lessons, and how to be flexible in prioritizing. It's not something that it's easier said than done, but it's really a challenge for every government.
From what I understand, there have been a lot of lessons on cutting red tape in all of this, which I think not just the MENA, but the rest of the world could learn from when you talk about efficiency and shifting priorities. I would like to say thank you, Karim. I don't know if there's anything else you want to wedge in, but from my point of view, it's been really informative and lovely to see you all. And I can only hope that we will meet and have a big bowl of delicious pasta together next year in Rome.
Thank you, Amy. I just, a couple of words that I, remember from the discussion: agility, initial conditions matter, reform, solidarity, inclusivity, sustainability, rethinking policies, SMEs, informal sector, the youth, social safety nets. So here are a little bit the impressions in a very short way that I, remember for the discussion. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to see you all, and looking forward to see you soon. Please stay safe, all of you, and see you next time, inshallah. Thank you, Amy, and nice being with you together in this event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ma salama.
As-salam. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye, all.